The debate hall in Washington, D.C., was filled with tension long before the cameras started rolling. A crowd of journalists, students, diplomats, and activists filled the seats, buzzing with anticipation. Tonight's topic was international aid and self-sufficiency, an issue that had become politically radioactive after recent controversies involving African resource control and U.S. foreign policy. On one side of the sleek, LED-lit stage stood Karoline Leavitt, a rising conservative firebrand. Sharp-tongued and unrelenting, she had made a name for herself by calling out what she described as global freeloading. On the other stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso. He was calm, collected, and radiated quiet strength. His dark blue suit stood in contrast to the American flags draped behind them, and his mere presence already challenged the narrative of dependency the evening was built upon. The moderator barely finished the introduction when Leavitt went straight for the jugular. "Let's not sugarcoat this," she said with a smirk, crossing her arms. "Burkina Faso and nations like it have survived for decades thanks to U.S. taxpayer dollars. USAID, military support, development programs, you name it. Without America, you can't survive." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the audience. The moderator blinked, surprised at the bluntness. Traoré didn't flinch. Leavitt wasn't done. "We've fed your people, built your roads, trained your soldiers. And now you want to tell us you don't need us anymore? That's not strength. That's ungratefulness dressed up as independence." Cameras zoomed in. The moment was already trending on X. Traoré's eyes narrowed slightly. He waited a few seconds before responding, as if weighing not just his words, but their legacy. When he spoke, his voice was low, precise, unshakably calm. "Miss Leavitt," he began, "I never asked for your pity, nor for your permission. What you call generosity, we often call leverage. What you call aid, we've experienced as control. And what you call survival," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "we now call history." The crowd froze. Leavitt's smile faltered, just slightly. "You say we can't survive without you?" Traoré continued, now leaning forward, his voice gaining quiet intensity. "Then watch us." It wasn't just a comeback, it was a challenge, a declaration of war against the narrative of dependency. The audience erupted. Some cheered, others booed. Online, the clip hit 1 million views in under 20 minutes. Karoline blinked, stunned. This wasn't going the way she'd planned. And for the first time that evening, it was clear, Ibrahim Traoré hadn't come to ask for anything. He came to end something. The moment Traoré uttered, "Then watch us," the debate stage wasn't just a room anymore, it was a battlefield. And the world had tuned in. Within an hour, every major news outlet had clipped the exchange. CNN ran it with the headline, "African leader challenges American arrogance." Fox News, on the other hand, called it, "Traoré's dangerous delusion." The clip dominated TikTok, Reddit, and late-night comedy monologues. It became the kind of moment people didn't just watch, they argued about it. But no one was more rattled than Karoline Leavitt. Backstage after the debate, she paced furiously, phone in hand, messages pouring in from aides, donors, and strategists. Her expression was half fury, half disbelief. "He made me look like a colonizer," she hissed to her assistant. "You saw the comments? They're calling me the villain." Across the city, in a quiet Georgetown townhouse, Traoré sat with a small team of advisors. No fanfare. No champagne. Just tea, strategy notes, and silence. "He hit a nerve," said his communications director, scrolling through reactions on her tablet. "Especially with the youth. Gen Z loves you right now." Traoré didn't smile. He wasn't there for applause. He stirred his tea slowly. "She said we can't survive without them," he said quietly. "But the real question is, how long have we survived with them? What has that survival cost us?" His chief advisor nodded. And now, they're scared. That's why the backlash is already starting. Indeed, within 24 hours, Karoline was back on air, this time with Tucker Carlson. Let's be clear, she said, sitting stiffly beneath bright lights. That man represents a country whose entire GDP is smaller than the budget of one U.S. state. He can grandstand all he wants, but the facts don't care about his feelings. Carlson leaned in. Do you regret saying they can't survive without us? No, she answered flatly. Because it's true. They need us more than they admit. And if Traoré doesn't realize that, then his people will pay the price. But behind her polished delivery, something had shifted. Her tone was defensive. Her eyes flicked, just for a second, off camera. Meanwhile, Traoré's phone buzzed again, this time with messages from leaders across Africa, Latin America, even Southeast Asia. Finally, one read. Someone said it out loud. In Paris, a French diplomat muttered, "This is going to be a problem." And in a hidden boardroom in Washington, a senior State Department official leaned back and sighed. He didn't come to debate, he said. He came to burn bridges. And maybe, just maybe, build something else. By the third day, Ibrahim Traoré wasn't just trending, he was being studied. In policy think tanks, university panels, and closed-door intelligence briefings, people replayed the same clip, Traoré, calm as stone, telling Karoline Leavitt, "Watch us." Some called it political theater. Others called it a turning point. But no one dismissed it. Inside the U.S. State Department, tension was rising. A meeting convened, screens glowing with transcripts and data dashboards. Traoré's approval ratings in his home country had surged overnight. Youth movements across West Africa were organizing rallies in his support. Even in cities like Lagos, Nairobi, and Johannesburg, murals of him began appearing, eyes forward, chin raised, with the quote underneath, "We now call history." "This is getting out of hand," said Deputy Secretary Langford. "He's becoming an icon." The room fell quiet. Not because of agreement, but fear. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt was in damage control. She'd launched a new campaign ad painting Traoré as a radical Marxist puppet and herself as the bold truth-teller. But it wasn't landing. People weren't buying the narrative anymore, not after they'd seen the footage for themselves. Worse, leaks began circulating. A clip of Karoline backstage surfaced, showing her sneering, "Let them build their own countries if they think they're so strong." The backlash was swift. On the other side of the Atlantic, Traoré remained composed, but he was watching everything. From his office in Ouagadougou, he addressed a gathering of local journalists. "We do not reject help," he said calmly. "We reject the kind of help that comes with chains." A hand rose from the back. "Mr. President, what do you say to the Americans who believe you're stirring resentment?" He didn't hesitate. Resentment is born when dignity is denied. We didn't start that fire. We simply stopped pretending it wasn't burning. In Washington, Karoline's advisors urged her to disengage. "He's winning the narrative," one said. "You'll only amplify him." But Karoline didn't back down. "We built the world they live in," she said during a Fox interview. "And I refuse to apologize for it." The words echoed around the world. That night, Traoré addressed a town hall in Bobo-Dioulasso. Thousands came. Farmers, students, business owners, teachers. "We're not anti-American," he said. "We are anti-domination. And there's a difference." The crowd roared. What had started as a televised insult was now global discourse. A war of words had become a war of worldviews. And Traoré? He wasn't backing down. The storm Karoline Leavitt had unleashed wasn't just shaking Twitter, it was shaking governments. But the most rattled weren't on camera. They were behind closed doors. At Langley, Virginia, headquarters of the CIA, sat a dozen senior analysts studying Traoré's rise like a case study in insurgent influence. One agent leaned back and muttered, "This is worse than when Sankara lit up the French." "Worse," corrected another, "because this time he's got a digital army." Indeed, every social media platform had become a war zone. American youth influencers posted side-by-side clips, Leavitt's smirk versus Traoré's calm stare. #WatchUS became a rallying cry, not just in Africa, but in Brooklyn, Berlin, Sao Paulo, and beyond. But in Washington, Karoline wasn't changing course. She doubled down. Attending conferences, appearing on right-wing podcasts, calling Traoré a dangerous nationalist who hates freedom. Her supporters clapped. Her critics exploded. And Ibrahim Traoré? He stayed silent. For 5 days, not a single tweet, speech, or public comment. Reporters speculated, was he scared? Planning something? Injured? Then came the announcement, Traoré would appear live at the United Nations General Assembly. Panic buzzed through U.S. diplomatic circles. What if he calls us out again? On a global stage, a State Department official asked. What if he does more than that, another said. What if he inspires? Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Traoré sat with his senior team. The room was quiet except for the clicking of keyboards and the soft whir of a ceiling fan. One of his aides placed a thick folder on the table. Here's what we know about Leavitt's foreign lobbying connections, especially to defense contractors. Some of her funding is tied to firms active in West Africa. Traoré didn't even glance at the folder. We're not here to destroy reputations, he said. We're here to reveal intentions. The aide nodded slowly. But the world will ask, why you? Why now? Traoré looked out the window. Because the ones who said we couldn't survive, never imagined we'd outgrow them. In a studio in Los Angeles, a Hollywood screenwriter whispered to her friend, this isn't a news cycle. This is the beginning of a movie. And in the next room over, Karoline's campaign team watched in silence as her poll numbers began to drop. The people weren't just listening to Traoré. They were hearing themselves in him. And that terrified her more than anything. New York City buzzed with electricity the morning Traoré arrived at the United Nations. Streets were sealed off. Protesters, supporters, and media lined the perimeter. Motorcades came and went, but all eyes were on the man from Burkina Faso. Inside the assembly hall, world leaders settled into their seats. Delegates whispered in anticipation. For many, this was more than a speech, it was a moment in history. Karoline Leavitt was in the audience, seated as part of the U.S. congressional delegation. She wore a calm expression, but her fingers tapped nervously on the armrest. She had underestimated him once. She wouldn't do it again. The lights dimmed. I invite His Excellency, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, said the Secretary General. The room erupted in applause, not thunderous, but meaningful. Traoré walked slowly to the podium. No teleprompter. No script. Just a man with something to say. He began, not with politics, but with a story. When I was 10, he said, my village had no electricity. At night, I studied by candlelight while American planes flew overhead. They weren't bombing us. They were flying somewhere else, to another place they called unstable. He paused, letting the room absorb the silence. Later, they said we were unstable. Poor. Hopeless. Dependent. So they came. With aid. With advice. With expectations. And slowly, we began to lose the one thing we could never afford to trade, our sovereignty. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. Some of that aid helped, he continued. But much of it came with fine print. The kind that rewrote our constitutions, our economies, even our culture. Now his tone sharpened. And last week, on a stage in Washington, I was told we can't survive without them. That our independence is a myth. That we owe our existence to their generosity. His eyes scanned the audience. No nation, he said slowly, owes its freedom to the charity of another. Freedom is not a favor. It is a right. The chamber went quiet. Ms. Leavitt, he said, turning slightly toward the U.S. delegation without naming her directly, you asked how we would survive without you. A pause. We will survive because we must. And we will thrive, because we are done asking permission. The audience broke into applause. Even some U.S. allies looked uncomfortable, torn between protocol and truth. Karoline's expression tightened. She was losing the room. And for the first time, the world wasn't just reacting to a speech. It was aligning with a voice. The world didn't just applaud Traoré's speech, it replayed it. On every major network. On every platform. In classrooms. In political science forums. Even in hip-hop lyrics by the end of the week. Karoline Leavitt, once so confident in her rhetorical muscle, found herself forced into a corner. The media headlines said it all. Traoré redefines diplomacy at the UN. Karoline Leavitt called it dependency, he called it dignity. From Burkina Faso to the world, a message that hit the West where it hurts. In the White House, President Biden met privately with senior advisors. Is he anti-American? Biden asked. No, said the national security advisor. He's anti-control. There's a difference. Biden exhaled. We pushed too far. Meanwhile, Karoline's camp tried to spin the moment. She appeared on national television again, this time trying to reframe her remarks as tough love. What I meant, she said, was that America has been a backbone of global development. Without our help, many nations would collapse. But it was too late. The narrative had shifted. What she intended as a message of strength was now read as entitlement. Condescension. And Traoré? He was now more careful than ever. He declined interviews. Avoided the spotlight. His press secretary issued short, firm statements. The president has said what he needed to say. The rest is action. And action did follow. Burkina Faso cancelled 2 U.S. aid programs that had clauses requiring the use of American contractors. They also invited delegations from Brazil, Indonesia, and Turkey for direct, peer-level talks, no translators, no intermediaries, no conditions. Meanwhile, on social media, global youth rallied behind him. Watch us. 2 words. Now tattooed on arms, painted on murals, turned into digital art, even projected onto buildings in Berlin and Cape Town. But not everyone was celebrating. Karoline Leavitt's team uncovered a new angle, Traoré's past. His military career. His alleged ties to foreign interests. They were ready to strike back. And while the world was applauding Traoré's courage, a storm was forming behind the scenes. A storm not of arguments, but of investigations. Because if they couldn't defeat him with debate, they'd try to break him with dirt. Karoline Leavitt was no stranger to political war. She knew the media loved a fall even more than a rise. So if Traoré couldn't be beaten in the arena of ideas, perhaps he could be bruised by shadows. Her team mobilized quickly. Private investigators were hired. Old files were pulled. A retired intelligence contractor whispered to a journalist, "There are rumors, Eastern funding, backdoor arms deals, a Russian advisor or 2. The headlines started surfacing. Traoré, independent leader or foreign pawn? Leaked docs suggest shadowy ties to China. But the stories lacked substance. No hard evidence. Just speculation wrapped in innuendo. Still, the seed was planted. Cable news panels lit up with debate. Traoré's photo appeared next to red, grainy maps of supposed influence operations. Karoline Leavitt leaned into the chaos. "Traoré says he doesn't need us," she said in an interview. "Maybe it's because he's already found someone else to serve." But this time, the world wasn't buying it. A group of American veterans published an op-ed defending Traoré, saying, "He speaks like the founders did, about sovereignty, not subservience." Youth activists in France protested outside Leavitt's embassy visit, chanting, "Respect African voice." And in Ouagadougou, Traoré made his move. He hosted a public forum, live-streamed globally, where independent journalists were invited to ask anything. No topics off-limits. One journalist asked about the alleged foreign ties. Traoré didn't flinch. "If independence means we cannot trade, speak, or partner with those who aren't in Washington's favor, then you are not describing sovereignty, you are describing empire," he said calmly. Another asked, "Are you anti-American?" "I admire much of what America was meant to be," Traoré replied. "But I will not let her worst instincts define my people's future." The room erupted in applause. The next day, a top French newspaper ran a bold headline. "They tried to smear him. He gave them a masterclass." And Karoline? Her plan had backfired. What was meant to damage his image had only sharpened it. She hadn't exposed weakness. She had revealed fear. A month after his UN address, Ibrahim Traoré announced a bold initiative, a multilateral summit in Ouagadougou titled the Sovereignty Forum. The invite list stunned the West, leaders from South America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and even European opposition figures. Not a single U.S. diplomat was invited. Washington was furious. Karoline Leavitt, now reeling from domestic backlash and international scorn, labeled the summit a gathering of anti-Western extremists. But that label only fueled interest. CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera covered the preparations. The world was watching, and waiting. Inside the modest yet secure hall of the summit, Traoré took the podium again. This time not as a lone voice, but as the host of a rising movement. "This is not a protest against the West," he began. "It is a conversation without it." That sentence hit like a lightning strike. Each guest nation shared stories of debt traps, resource exploitation, military interference. Common wounds, different continents. And yet, under Traoré's careful moderation, the conversation stayed focused, not on bitterness, but on alternatives. "Dependency," he said, "is not destiny. It is design. And design can be changed." Meanwhile, in the U.S., Karoline sat in a strategy meeting with defense contractors and foreign affairs donors. Her political backers demanded results. She offered a bold pitch. Cut his internet visibility. Apply pressure through sanctions. Make his voice hard to hear. But within 48 hours, that plan collapsed. A leak from inside her circle exposed the meeting notes to the press. The headline on Reuters read, "Congresswoman's team sought to mute African leaders' global reach." It was a PR disaster. And Traoré? He said nothing. But the summit's closing photo, leaders standing arm in arm under the banner, "Mutual Respect, Mutual Power," said everything. People across the global South reposted it like a declaration. Back in Washington, Karoline was advised to lie low. Her strategist said flatly, "You tried to silence a man by mocking him. Now half the world's listening to him, and not to you." In Burkina Faso, as the summit ended, a teenage girl interviewed Traoré for her local school project. "What would you say to someone who thinks you can't survive without America?" she asked shyly. Traoré smiled. "I wouldn't say anything," he replied. "I'd show them." Karoline Leavitt sat in her D.C. office, the glow of her phone screen casting harsh shadows on her face. Her political capital was draining fast. Cable news stopped inviting her. Think tanks distanced themselves. Even some of her Republican colleagues whispered that she had picked the wrong fight. Then the phone rang. It wasn't a donor. It wasn't a consultant. It was the State Department. "Congresswoman, we need to talk," said a low, careful voice. "About what?" "Traoré. He's building something real. This summit of his, it's more than optics. He's making trade deals without us. Energy agreements. Educational programs. Military cooperation that cuts us out. And you, whether you meant to or not, accelerated it." Karoline froze. "You need to fix this," the voice continued. "Or step aside." Click. She sat for a long time, not moving. Then she opened her laptop. She rewatched the debate, the moment where she mocked his country's future. The moment she laughed. The moment he didn't. His calm. His restraint. The phrase he used, "watch us." She finally understood what she hadn't back then. He didn't need applause. He needed space. And she had given it to him, in the worst way possible. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Traoré met privately with his closest advisors. "They're destabilizing themselves," one said. "No," Traoré replied. "They're waking up." A young journalist approached with a question before he entered a press briefing. "Mr. President, are you now leading an anti-American alliance?" Traoré stopped. "I am leading nothing," he said. "We are standing. If standing for ourselves looks like rebellion to others, then maybe they should ask why." The next morning, the New York Times ran the headline. "He didn't start a revolution. He just refused to bow." Back in Washington, Karoline scribbled a sentence on a notepad and circled it over and over. "Respect is not given. It's earned, or lost." She had underestimated Traoré. And now, the only voice that mattered wasn't hers. It was his. And it was everywhere. 6 months later, the world had changed more than the news cycle could track. Burkina Faso had announced a groundbreaking economic coalition with 3 other West African nations, built on fair trade, mutual investment, and complete autonomy from Western financial institutions. No IMF. No World Bank. No political strings attached. Traoré had become a symbol, not of defiance, but of design. A new model. Students across Latin America quoted his speeches. Billboards in Southeast Asia featured his likeness beside the words, "Stand tall." Even in parts of Europe, his face became an icon for those tired of technocrats and transactional diplomacy. In the United States, Karoline Leavitt's influence waned. She remained in office, but her name was now a cautionary tale. In debates, young activists called it "doing a Karoline," mocking something before understanding it. In one final attempt at damage control, Karoline requested a closed-door meeting with Traoré at the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. Surprisingly, he agreed. They sat across from each other. No cameras. No advisors. Just silence. "I was wrong," she said finally. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply said, "I know." She took a breath. "Why did you accept this meeting?" "Because you needed it," he replied. She looked away. "You've reshaped the conversation." "No," he said. "I just stopped asking for permission to speak." When she stood to leave, he added one final thought. "You wanted to teach me a lesson about power. But it was you who learned that power doesn't come from being heard, it comes from having something worth hearing." As she walked out, she whispered under her breath, "Watch us." Traoré heard it. And replied without turning. "We already did." Outside, as the summit continued, a young African delegate handed Traoré a note. It read, "Thank you, for showing the world we don't need to be told who we are to know who we are." Traoré folded it and placed it in his jacket. In a world that once mocked him, he now stood as proof. That dignity, when spoken clearly, could silence any room. And sometimes the loudest thing you can say, is simply in a world where power is too often measured by volume. Ibrahim Traoré proved that true strength lies in clarity, purpose, and restraint. They told him he couldn't survive without them. They laughed, they mocked, they underestimated. But he didn't shout back. He simply stood his ground. And the world listened. This wasn't just a debate. It was a turning point. Because dignity doesn't need permission. And independence doesn't need validation. So the next time someone says, "You can't survive without us," remember the answer that echoed across continents. Watch us.